Hi, I'm John.
And I'm Traci.
And this is Your History, the new podcast series from Mentor Public Library, where the resident history nerds at the library, that is to say, me and Traci, talk about history stuff that we're interested in. We're going to start this first episode by talking about some books that we're interested in. But in future, we might do some other stuff, especially things related to the talks that we're doing or just historical stuff that we're interested in. So I know that Traci has kind of different historical interests than I have, although they're somewhat overlapping, as we're going to see in a minute here. But what's the first thing you wanted to talk about today?
I wanted to talk about Queen Elizabeth II and especially her early life, because that is my area of interest of her reign. So I actually read the book Young Elizabeth, Making of a True Queen by Kate Williams. And Kate Williams has done a number of books on royalty, but I really was interested in the Queen, especially because for her 95th birthday, I did a talk on her early life. She was not supposed to be queen. She actually was just supposed to be a princess and kind of ordinary on the sidelines of the royal family. Was actually supposed to be her uncle, Edward, who became Edward VIII's job, and if he had children, their job as well. But it describes how she and her parents got along. They were originally a unit called We Four, her parents, her and her sister Margaret. And it also shows that the Queen, devoted to her service, was much like her grandparents. And even though she grew up very sheltered, she had a normal life. She was able to go swimming and take classes and make friends, but she wasn't destined for that life. And her grandfather actually founded the House of Windsor. It was originally a German name, but it was not appropriate to have that type of name in 1917. So he did change it after World War I ended. And she shares struggles with her people. She did struggle during World War II, and she did join the military. So it shows those experiences that built her and how her parents and grandparents guided her to be the queen she is today.
Yeah, it seems like both the Elizabeths weren't really necessarily destined to actually be queen, although Elizabeth I was, her sort of getting to be queen was a little more fraught than Elizabeth II's was.
Yes, that's definitely for sure. Elizabeth I lived in a time that was extremely turbulent, and there were many times in her life she didn't know if she would actually live to tell the tale. But they did have striking parallels, as they both became queen at 25, and they both were third in line to the throne.
Yeah, what was it that Elizabeth I said when they told her that Queen Mary had died?
It's the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And she was actually standing under an oak tree, according to legend, in the middle of November.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. The English royal family stuff is always really fascinating. And actually, that kind of relates to the first thing that I want to talk about. This is Peter Ackroyd's, I believe it's still his latest book, The History of England, Part 6, Innovation. Peter Ackroyd is a novelist. I think he's written more than 20 novels, but he's also written a huge number of history books, mostly about England. He did a really great biography of William Shakespeare. Ackroyd is a very readable writer, which is good because his books tend to be ginormous. We were talking about this earlier, that this book is about, 500 pages long, 460 pages long, which makes seem like a lot, except that some of his earlier books have been even longer than that. I've been reading this book, this series, since basically it starts, I think the earliest period he's talking about is kind of the Romano-British period. The earlier ones, they're enjoyable, but people are always having their entrails cut out. I mean, that was just something that kind of happened in the Middle Ages and up into the 17th century, unfortunately. I read his book Rebellion when I was preparing to do the talk that I did a couple of months ago on the English Civil War, and Rebellion is one of the best history books I've ever read. It's really, it's written in a really engaging style. It tells this really ripping story, but it's also got just a wealth of really funny details in it. He quotes a lot from Samuel Pepys. If you know anything about Samuel Pepys was a bureaucrat in the naval bureaucracy in England in the 17th century. He kept a very extensive diary in which he wrote about lots of things that might want to get secret. I mean, he was a very inveterate skirt chaser, even by the standards of the 17th century. But also he had a lot of insights into what kind of everyday life was like in London. And anyway, Ackroyd does a great job of weaving in those bits of the narrative. Innovation is actually about the sort of beginning of the 20th century. You can kind of see it's got a picture of Elizabeth II on the front. The previous one, Dominion, which is actually kind of short relatively. I mean, I think it's only about 350 pages. These page tallies might sound big, but you know, you should definitely be aware that Ackroyd he writes like a novelist, like he's telling the story, and it's really very entertaining. And he just provides a kind of wealth of detail about everything you might want to know, you know, what life was like for normal people, and how the sort of high politics of what was going on in Great Britain at the time really affected what was going on for sort of normal, like everyday, non-royal or non-notable people. But he also tells a number of sort of really interesting overlapping stories. Dominion, which is about the Victorian era, has a lot of really interesting stories about how British print culture got going, like British newspapers and stuff in the 19th century. The preceding one has even more about how there's a sort of interesting element of how the British press law, they've had this like law governing what you could publish and censorship and stuff like that, and kind of lapsed at the end of the 17th century and was never re-upped. And everybody was like, now is the time, I will start my journal. But yeah, this is a really, I really recommend the Ackroyd books generally. Like, he's a really entertaining writer, and it really gets you into kind of like, you know, why history is interesting. History shouldn't just be like a stream of like dates and battles and you know, whatever, but it's really kind of lives that people lived. And I think Ackroyd does a really good job of talking about that.
Yeah, and I think it's always interesting to learn about the common people, because people read a lot of books about famous historical figures, but you don't really always learn about how the average person lived. So that's really interesting that was tied into the book as well.
Yeah, we know a lot more about people who write because they write. I mean, this is an interesting thing I've been doing prep lately for the talk that I'm giving next month about the origins of the Constitution. And one of the things that was sort of pointed out in a book I was reading is that, you know, one of the reasons that the stamp tax, all the sort of taxes that Parliament was imposing on the colonies were unpopular. I mean, you know, as James Otis Jr. wrote, no, taxation without representation is tyranny. Of course, nobody likes taxation with representation, but that's another matter. But one of the reasons that the Stamp Act really got people's attention was because it taxed paper, it taxed like newspaper writers, lawyers, scholars. I mean, the kind of people who were really well placed to gripe about things in public. And that was one of the reasons why the sort of opposition to the stamp tax like grew so radically, was because they taxed the exact kind of people who were used to, you know, griping about things and trying to sort of go out and get things done about them. So what else do you have for us today?
I have Crown of Blood, The Deadly Inheritance of Lady Jane Grey by Nicola Tallis. And I chose Jane Grey because she's usually an ignored figure in British history. In fact, she's usually skipped over when people are talking about the different monarchs and so on, even though she technically was a ruler, even if it was for 9 to 13 days. She is equally as interesting. In fact, we have almost no information on her life besides bits and pieces of whatever anyone can dig up. She was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, who at one time was the Queen Consort of France. Henry VIII's son did not want a Catholic on the throne, so he was devoutly Protestant, and he was determined not to let his half-sister, Mary I, rule England after he died. So he gave it to Jane. The reason he didn't give it to Elizabeth I was because you can't exclude Mary and have Elizabeth rule. That just wasn't going to fly in any circumstance whatsoever. But Jane really did charm people. Her tutors loved her. A lot of Protestant scholars, Catherine Parr, who she was living with, and Thomas Seymour, who took care of her in London. She was one of the most intelligent people during her time, possibly even more so than Elizabeth I, who was really known for how intelligent and scholarly she was. Jane overall was overthrown by Mary. She didn't have the support she needed. And people really wanted Henry VIII's daughter to rule England. They just didn't want anybody else on that throne. So Jane is a victim of power. She was eventually executed, even though Mary didn't really want to at first. But she had to, especially to get that Spanish alliance with her husband, Philip II, which she was determined to have at any cost because her mother was Catherine of Aragon, who was Spanish. So Jane had to die, and she was willing to die for her Protestant faith and became a martyr. Even though she was only a teenager when she died, she showed strength well beyond her years of life.
Yeah, Jane Grey is she's one of those figures who I sort of know who she is because I have a kind of general knowledge of the period, but it's really interesting that there was this kind of interregnum most people are unaware of before Mary became queen. There was still a fairly considerable Catholic influence in Britain at the time, although Protestantism was really the sort of coming thing and sort of really was cemented by Elizabeth's rule, which lasted quite a long time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it was 44 years. So it was the longest of any Tudor monarch. And she was the longest reigning female monarch until Victoria, I believe. And then, of course, Her Majesty, the current queen after that.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing, too, because the sort of the norms of the law of who can be king in Europe at the time were very much, it's got to be a guy. And then you have 3 straight women, and one of whom ends up reigning for longer than the lifespan of a large proportion of the people over whom she ruled.
Yes, for sure. In fact, she had families serve her, Elizabeth I. She had the Carey family. She had 3 generations of that family serve her. And so she had a grandmother and her granddaughter, both of the same name, Catherine Carey, serving her during their lifetimes.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And the Jane Grey book, really sounds interesting, especially given that, she was a monarch for such a short period of time that you wouldn't necessarily know that sort of period was as crucial as it was.
Yeah, it was really a bridge between the Tudors. It definitely went beyond what people would have ever thought, because Edward VI was also, like Jane, manipulated because he was so young, he was 15, manipulated by his advisors, like Jane was. And they were actually manipulated by John Dudley, both of them, in a sense. And John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was desperate to have his son on that throne and actually married him to Jane against both of their wills, really. And Jane did not want him to rule with her at all. And she was not going to allow Guilford to be called king. And that really upset that entire Dudley family.
Yeah, I bet it did. Did you, by the way, random question, watch the Tudor series that came out a few years ago?
I did not get into it, but I know that so many people enjoyed it, and it did go on for a long period of time. And the costumes are really interesting in that. I just didn't quite get into it myself.
Yeah,
but there are several different movies on the Tudors that I loved. So
yeah. We can talk. Maybe we'll do another episode of that. It's the one thing I remember thinking when I was watching that series, which I thought kind of went on sort of a little longer than maybe it ought to have. And I enjoyed the sets more than I enjoyed the story. But every time Thomas Cromwell showed up, I remember thinking, you're going to get yours soon, pal.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's about all we have time for today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will be back with more history stuff next month, maybe. Okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, bye.